colleagues, we're already 15 minutes late, and we have a vote that's going to interrupt. I'd look to colleagues to give us some discretion on the vote, and we'll call it maybe 5 minutes before the vote. Is that all right? It is a procedural vote. We have with us General Smith and General Ritchie. General Smith is well known to this committee, and this is pursuant to a resolution on the part of the committee to get a briefing on Ukraine in the Baltic region. Appreciate your attendance and appreciate your patience, and anticipate we will appreciate your future patience. So with that, we'll begin, and I just want to welcome Dr. Pawlowski to the committee. Obviously, the whip didn't talk to me, and we are going to have to coordinate on ties. So, General Smith or General Ritchie, you have 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm honored to appear before you today. As stated, I'm Major General Greg Smith, Director General of International Security Policy at the Department of National Defence, and with me I have Major General Bob Ritchie, Director of Staff at the Strategic Joint Staff. Nous vous remercions de l'occasion de...
Thank you for this opportunity to update the committee on the situation in Ukraine and Canada's commitments.
Russia's war of aggression is now well into its third year. Russia continues to inflict significant damage and suffering onto Ukraine, leveraging its advantage in personnel and artillery ammunition to achieve incremental but steady advances across the front line. The armed forces of Ukraine have also inflicted significant losses on the Russians, but have paid a high price in doing so. La récente incursion ukrainienne dans la région de
Ukraine's recent incursion in the Kursk region clearly caught the Russians off guard. Although Russia continues to make incremental but significant advances on the Donbas region, it has been forced to redeploy over 30,000 troops to Kursk. Ukrainian forces appear to be digging in and are presenting a serious challenge for Russia to reclaim its territory. While it is still too early to assess the strategic consequences of the offensive, the incursion has upended prevailing narratives of Ukraine's inability to counter Russian military dominance. This has boosted morale among Ukrainian troops, and Ukraine's leadership appears optimistic that others will see through Russia's supposed red lines. Ukraine has shifted from presenting the Kursk region as strictly to defend its Sumy Oblast to now integrating it into a newly announced victory plan that we understand is now being socialized with the U.S.
Russia's airstrikes continue to exploit Ukraine vulnerabilities by successfully bombing Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, grocery stores, and apartment building complexes. The destruction of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has led to significant energy deficits and power outages, once again leaving Ukraine in a precarious position for the upcoming winter. Si elle reçoit assez de soutien,
with sufficient support, Ukraine can win this war. It requires timely, dependable, and coordinated aid from Western partners to overcome Russia's advantage in size and resources. Under Operation Unifier, Canada has now trained over 42,000 Ukrainian Armed Forces personnel since 2015. Increasingly, the flow of knowledge goes both ways, as Ukrainians have become experts in Russian tactics, techniques, and procedures.
Spring, Canada signed an agreement on security cooperation between Canada and Ukraine, in which we committed to providing broad, multifaceted support for Ukraine. Under the agreement, DND-CAF will continue to provide military assistance, training, and capacity building to the armed forces of Ukraine. We will also continue our collaboration, information sharing, research and development, material cooperation, support for reforms, and more. These efforts aim to help Ukraine build a strong and sustainable force, fully operable with NATO and capable of regaining and defending its territory now and deterring future aggression. Le sommet de l'OTAN de 2024 qui a eu lieu à Washington.
The July 2024 NATO Washington summit was particularly consequential as it provided NATO leaders an opportunity to reaffirm their solidarity with Ukraine and set out long-term predictable assistance. At the summit, Canada committed an additional $500 million in support as part of NATO's long-term pledge for Ukraine.
Launch of the NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine, located in Wiesbaden, Germany. Here we will work with allies under a NATO command structure to coordinate the provision of military training, equipment, and logistical support to the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Finally, we announced at the summit that Canada will allocate up to $389 million of previously announced funding to enhance F-16 pilot training through the Ukraine Defense Contact Group Air Force Capability Coalition. This commitment will support training for Ukrainian pilots and provide equipment to support Ukraine's safe operation of F-16s. Un simple fait ressort de mon expérience dans la livraison de...
The experience of delivering this military aid and training to Ukraine as it battles again Russian aggression has underscored a simple fact to me. Canada's support is essential, critical, and we must do more to support Ukraine. The decisions we will make now will shape the coming decades, and we must rise to the occasion. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for your time.
General Smith. Mr. Brizan, do you want to go or do you want to?
You're going first.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for your presentation. Now, half the TAPV reconnaissance vehicles sent to Latvia are unserviceable and not operating. No spare parts and no money to fix them have been sent over. Half the vehicles were broken, I believe 8 in total, 4 unserviceable. There's no cash, no parts, no people. We're told there's a 50% chance the war will spill into NATO countries and Canadian soldiers are on the front lines with half the reconnaissance vehicles operable. What's the survivability rate of the women and men we've sent to Latvia?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So obviously this represents a key capability, and we're working to furnish spare parts as well as working with our allies to make sure that there is sustainment for these critical capability vehicles that are forward, empowering the mobility of our Ukrainian partners. In terms of the protection of the vehicle in question, it certainly does not have the survivability protection that a more robust armored fighting vehicle would have. But those were the vehicles that were made available, mindful that other donations have been made as well.
Having his budget for infrastructure cut in half for this year, the commander for base Petawawa is having to close down several hundred sleeping quarters, leaving new recruits with nowhere to live. Black mold, vermin, together with faulty plumbing, electrical service, have made them uninhabitable. There's another 7,500 troops that are going to cycle through Petawawa for training for Latvia for the next deployment. So where are they going to sleep while training in Petawawa?
Chair, I can't speak to the specifics about the 7,000, but with the new defense policy, Our North Strong and Free, there's considerable amount of money being put into infrastructure. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done, but it's recognized and we have a plan to start moving forward.
Well, there's, in fact, the amount of money last year allocated for infrastructure in that particular base was $21 million. The year prior was 41 with the top of 51. With no money for infrastructure, the World War I era firing ranges upkeep on base Petawawa, they're actually sinking. And they can no longer be used. So how are soldiers supposed to learn how to shoot if there's no place to practice?
Mr. Chair, again, the specifics, I haven't been to Petawawa for a couple months, and some would know it better than I do, but it's a great base. There is a plan for putting more money into it, and indeed for training, but there are thousands and thousands of troops that have cycled through there to do incredible training that have allowed them to be very, very successful in Latvia.
Mr. Chair, if I might add, we prioritize 3 things. One is readiness, which includes what was described in terms of preparing for operations and time on the range, as well as modernization of future capabilities, and then our people.
Money to fix up the range and no place for them to stay. Okay, so according to NORAD, 2 1138 military aircraft were detected and tracked while operating in the Alaska Air Defense Identification Zone on September 14th, marking the third such incident in 1 week. What message is Russia trying to send us?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We're actually aware of 5 interactions in the north. In partnership with NORAD, the appropriate responses were taken. And I can assure you that at no time did those aircraft pose a threat to Canada.
Okay, so given our government's record of defense procurements plagued with delays and overruns, how confident are you in Canada's defense procurement record when it pertains to getting Ukrainian forces the equipment and the weapons they need to fight back against the Russians?
Mr. Chair, I think we have a very good story to tell of getting weapons in the hands of the Ukraine. My analogy has always been when the war started in February of 2022, everybody reached into the weapons locker behind them and handed that weapon to Ukraine. Depending on the size of the country and their armed forces, they ran out of weapons quickly. We now have $4.5 billion worth of weapons and military material committed to Ukraine, and the team that works under me is moving that as quickly as possible to get into the hands of the Ukrainians.
That equipment getting into the hands of Ukrainian soldiers, or at least getting over to Europe. It takes quite a while for the equipment to actually get into Ukraine. What about the equipment for Canadian soldiers? Where are the replacement orders? When are the soldiers here in Canada going to have equipment to train on?
Mr. Chair, I think we're actually getting the equipment into the hands of the Ukrainians pretty quickly. We have to make sure that we're using taxpayers' money correctly. And so the team that I work with have to make sure that we work with other government agencies to get that money looked at properly, get the contracts put in place properly so that that money is used wisely for the taxpayers. And then we get it over as quickly as possible all the way across the ocean into Ukraine, which is a war zone. So it does take a little bit of time, but we do a good job and we do it as fast as we can.
For the equipment for our soldiers here in Canada in case they have to be deployed. After all, there's a chance that they will be deployed in a hot situation. What would you like to see from the Government of Canada to ensure future commitments to Ukraine for weapons and equipment be expedited so they could be brought to the front lines in the most immediate manner?
Mr. Chair, very quickly, I think we're doing a good job doing that. Again, more money was just given at the Washington, D.C., $500 million. We're moving through that right now to give advice to the minister. And again, get those in the hands of the Ukrainian soldiers.
Mr. Collins, 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I'll be sharing a portion of my time with my friend and colleague, Mr. Pawlowski. Welcome, Generals. I'm going to take us to where the member opposite left off, and that is the logistics and how the support that we're providing is landing in the hands of those who need it the most, and that's the Ukrainian military. And there's been a lot of discussion in our past meetings when you've provided updates on this same subject matter about, you know, it's not there when they need it, and they haven't received what we promised, and a lot of promises, and so that, you know, the nonsensical political narrative that we continue to hear. But from the testimony that you just provided, you made it very clear that it is landing in the appropriate hands and it's getting there in a timely manner. And I think in your opening statement, you said it's essential that the support we provide is timely and dependable. Can you share with the committee in terms of what equipment has been the most valuable equipment that the Ukrainians have utilized in terms of Canadian support that's been provided? And can you talk about the supply lines that make their way from the supplier or from our stockpiles that we have here in Canada through to Europe and into the Ukraine in order for their military to use that support to the best of their ability?
Mr. Chair, thanks for the question. First of all, I'd just like to characterize it's not just me and my team that look at what the Ukrainians need. We work with the Ukrainians themselves. We're tied into an organization in Germany that I mentioned earlier, the SAG-U. Talk with our allies what they're doing. Speak to the Ukrainians both in Ukraine and here in Ottawa to make sure that that's their choice. That's what they're looking for, and then move it as quickly as possible. And as I said, it's a lot of money. It's taxpayers' money, and we've got to make sure that we do it properly and then transport it a very long way to get it there. And again, it doesn't go directly into Ukraine.
Can that conversation go somewhere else? please.
So-
Please continue.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And so as a quick example of what some of the things that we're donating, drones. This is a conflict in which I think what we're learning and what we're seeing in drone warfare is, I guess we'll call it evolutionary, but at the same time, it's shocking to see. And Canadian industry has stepped up, and we have committed to over 900 drones that are being used there. And again, got to get them over there. We need to train the Ukrainians on them and then get to them to use them and then get the feedback on how that's going. So drones is just one example of success.
I see flashing. So we got 15 minutes.
What you need to ask, what you see.
Yeah, I'm just going to, so can we suspend it in 10 minutes?
I will go back.
Well, you're a fast walker. You're a fast walker.
Finish off this round, and that's all I'll be concerned for.
Okay, well, that's 12 minutes.
No, not 12. Finish off this one question.
Oh, that's not, yeah, that's,
Whoever's on to speaking this, Mr. Collins, and then otherwise I don't consent.
okay, well, consent is required. So, Mr. Collins, continue.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. General, I've listened to a lot of what General Eyre has said over the last number of months, just in terms of where we're at from a global perspective with our own military and some of the challenges that we Canadians face, as well as those across the world with threats that come our way. He talked about the biggest threat to our nation right now is disinformation. And I know that a big part of the war effort from Russia is trying to convince other nations and their citizenry not to support Ukrainian efforts, and we see that in the U.S. with J.D. Vance kind of leading the charge and former President Trump talking about pulling support for this effort and having it wrapped up by the time he's sworn in, if he's successful. And so there's a lot of misinformation out there. Russia's actually paying people to spread that information, and Department of Justice recently released a report where some social media influencers in the States were found to have received $10 million from Russia. So all that to say that there's a lot going on behind the scenes that we're not aware of. How are you combating disinformation that's coming from Russia and some of their supporters, China and others, as it relates to targeting our military personnel, as well as trying to erode the faith that people have in our institutions here in Canada, whether it's our military or otherwise?
Chair, I'll obviously restrict myself to the Canadian Armed Forces. But that being said, I think proper communication with the members of the Canadian Armed Forces, the chain of command, talking to them and their families at any time, telling them the truth of what's going on. That's our key challenge, is to communicate with a very large nation, people scattered across both Canada and internationally, is just communicate with them and tell them what we're doing in this particular case to support Ukraine. And again, I think we have a very good story to tell.
Mr. Chair, I might just add that the Canadian Forces obviously remaining ready, resilient, and relevant. And when we see these threats emerge, we over-communicate amongst ourselves with our allies and partners to make sure that we are all mindful of the pervasive threat.
Rest of my time to Member Pawlowski.
Our Prime Minister recently stated Canada fully supports Ukraine using long-range weaponry to prevent and interdict Russia's continued ability to degrade Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and mostly to kill innocent civilians. Some of our allies seem to be a little more cautious about the use of long-range weapons to target Russian targets within Russia outside of the Kherson region. It seems, and it seems perhaps this is changing, but the concern seems to be Putin's continued threats that this is going to escalate the conflict between Russia and NATO. What is our assessment of the risk of providing long-range weaponry and allowing the Ukrainians to use it?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So indeed, on the 13th of September, our Prime Minister did say that there would be no constraints on any Canadian-donated weapons and systems. And in fact, the following day, the chair of the NATO Military Committee, Admiral Bauer, stated the same thing, and specifically he said every country has a right to defend itself, and that doesn't stop at the border of your own nation. To the question, Mr. Chair, the M777 howitzers, which were initially quite prevalent at the start of the campaign, have a range about 30 kilometers, depending on the ammunition used. Some of these longer range capabilities that have been spoken to can be more than 10 times that range, 300 to 500 kilometers. And therefore, they do provide the ability to strike further in depth, although certainly not into deep Russian territory. What they can do, though, is create vulnerabilities for the adversary, specifically Russian assembly areas, command and control, bridges, railways, and critical infrastructure, and therefore create more of a buffer between the front line of troops and where they're mobilizing.
Answer there because we only have consent to go for the final this round. So colleagues, I suppose we have to suspend while, are we suspending or adjourning? Yeah, suspend while there's a vote that takes place. Unfortunately, we don't have consent to shrink the vote. Ms. Malond.
Yeah, very briefly, I would certainly appreciate if the member, Mr. Mazan, could reconsider his perspective. I understand that whips sometimes talk to each other 10 minutes before, 10 minutes after. This is about Ukraine, our efforts that we're doing. I'm sure there's relevance to listening to the information that these wonderful individuals, that people that serves our country came.
No, it's not adjourned. We're suspending, unfortunately. So colleagues, we've lost some time with the vote. What I propose is that we complete this round with General Smith and Ritchie, starting with Madame Normandin and Masson, and then we invite Ukrainian ambassador to the table. She makes an opening statement, and then we have, with time left, and I'm proposing that we extend to 6 o'clock. So we should have roughly an hour, a little less, a little more, a little less. The generals have agreed to stay along with the ambassador, and we'll continue a regular round of questions. I'm thinking that if we did a 4-minute round as an opening, and so that other people can get involved in questions as well, and hopefully we'll work this thing through. So, is that agreeable with everybody? That's kind of the.
Mr. Chair,
Sure.
I would just suggest that if we have until 6 o'clock, you should be able to get everybody in on 5-minute rounds.
When we get there. Yeah. Okay, with that, we'll call on Madame Normandin for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'll take a couple of seconds before I start asking questions to table a motion that I don't intend to debate today, but at least it's a notice of motion. It will just be circulated by email, given that the members of this committee learned at the end of June 2024 in a Globe and Mail article that the former Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan ordered the special forces deployed by Canada and Afghanistan in August 2021 to take part in an evacuation operation of Sikh Afghans, given their religious identity, that following the passage of this motion, that the committee invite the following witnesses: the Minister of National Defense, Mr. Bill Blair, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Madame Melanie Joly, officials for a minimum of 2 hours, former Minister of National Defense, Mr. Harjit Sajjan, for a minimum of 2 hours, the Chief of the Defense Staff at the time, and all witnesses that the committee sees fit, and that the committee report on its conclusions or recommendations to the House. The interpreter did not have that motion in the booth. Gentlemen, I'd like to hear what you have to say as to Ukraine's current needs with respect to the 155 millimeter weapons. Where are we in terms of demand, in terms of the global capacity to provide these weapons and Canadian capacity to provide this? Do you have any indicators in a general sense as to that? Thank you.
Merci de votre question.
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chair. We are currently providing these 155 millimeter artillery ammunition rounds. We've increased the amount from 3,000 per month to 5,000 per month. We understand that there is not strictly one country that can meet the needs of our Ukrainian friends, so we are working collaboratively with our allies and partners to meet the demand. I'd like to hear what you have to say regarding an aspect that we haven't discussed much or heard much about, something that would change things for Ukraine, the drone situation. I know Canada is a part of the drone coalition led by Latvia and the UK, among others. What does this mean for Canada? What role would Canada play as a partner in this coalition? Are there things in the works that would be good to know?
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quickly, I'll address the issue of drones. First, Canada contributes about 900 drones, and this costs so far several $1 million. And this is a direct contribution to Ukraine. They are currently Ukrainians are currently being trained to operate these drones. Furthermore, as was mentioned, there is a drone coalition, meaning that there's a group of countries that are working together. I'm not sure if you've ever watched Dragon's Den, there's something that they're trying to create that is similar to a sort of drone market that would give Ukraine exactly what they need or it needs. As I said earlier, there are so many threats through drones that technology is evolving rapidly from day to day, and trying to provide the most modern drones that are really operational on the battlefield.
Merci, j'ai envie de prendre...
I'd like to get back to the issue of new technologies. We know technology evolves quickly, as you were saying, and one of the concerns that the military industry has, they're ready to provide new useful technology, but they have to go through the Defense Department, and then whenever it's new technology, also have to go through ISED, which means there's a vetting process which is quite lengthy for new technology. I don't know if you're aware of that, or if you have anything to say to the fact that the approval process is very lengthy for new technology specifically. Mr. Chair, as to what we're doing and our contribution to Ukraine, I'm unaware of the work being done with ISED, but rather CCC. That is Canadian Corporate, anyhow, CCC, Contracting Corporation, I think is what it's called. Inaudible?
Better on this one. CCC. Nous travaillons avec eux.
So we're working with this important agency, CCC. We're working with them to draw up contracts. It's very important. We are not experts in that field. And now, as far as technology is concerned, we're working within the ecosystem, the drone ecosystem in Canada, and we've already contributed about 900 drones. We are working with our allies, of course, now as well on this in the context of the coalition. I know I don't have much time left, but out of the $500 million announced at the NATO summit, what can you give us in terms of a breakdown of the $500 million? Mr. Chair, we provided advice to the minister on that front. We are looking forward to an announcement, but we want to deliver that to the minister and then announce precisely what we will be doing with those funds. Of course, this was announced in July. We have the funds, and now we have to get through the various next steps so the minister may make a decision. Question. So if I understand, the $500 million announcement was made by the minister before the minister knew what he would do with those amounts? Usually we receive the funds, we have access to the funds, and then we provide, how can I put this? There are many options, so we need to speak with our allies, the Ukrainians, to see what they want to do with this funding, and then we can take action. It's important to cooperate. Thank you.
Reste une minute?
I still have a minute. Oh, great. I think you discussed this with Dr. Pawlowski briefly. From a quantitative standpoint, what effect this could have. The idea of having long-range strikes deep into Russian territories. What we understand what that means, but what could this actually mean in terms of the turns of events and Ukraine actually getting the upper hand, potentially? Thank you for your question, Mr. Chair. There is a risk that things could evolve horizontally or vertically. It could actually increase the levels of conflict if the Russians aren't able to meet their ends. They could consider other options. So I think our allies with these weapons are making decisions very carefully to be sure of the impact of their decisions. And of course, Canada and NATO, just as much, we're all aware of the effect of using these longer range weapons.
In 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both the Major Generals for appearing today. I've had several meetings with incredible people in my community, specifically from the London chapter of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. They have signified to me the importance of course, the identity of the 20,000 children that have been abducted by Russia. obviously, many human rights organizations are fearing that this number is actually higher. Russia has abducted the children. They've put them into re-education camps. They've forced them to accept Russian passports. They've subjected these children to abuse, the denial of medical treatment. International law is clear, and of course, the House passed a motion stating that Putin is committing a genocide and that Putin must be held responsible and accountable by those rules by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Can you update the committee on Canada's intelligence on these children, how we're helping the Ukrainians return the children back to their homes?
Mr. Chair. So we are very conscious that there are 4 regions, specifically Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, that are currently in Russian possession. And certainly we've been tracking the number of children as well as the number of killed and wounded. We are also of the opinion, alongside our allies, that the Russians are committing contraventions of the law of armed conflict in terms of their targeting. And we're working with like-minded allies once areas are liberated to reunite members with their proper Ukrainian families.
Okay. Now, you had also mentioned earlier in the testimony the targeting of civilian infrastructure, making it very difficult, of course, for the upcoming winter. That civilian infrastructure is also Putin's intentionally targeting hospitals, as we understand, mass punishment to pressure the Ukrainians to fall and to pressure them into their demands. They're weaponizing human suffering. They're supporting those illegal annexations, the occupation of the Donbass. Now, Canadians are very proud, of course, of our work standing up for international law and everything we can do to stop Putin's crimes. Can you update the committee on how we're supporting the resilience of Ukraine's infrastructure to ensure adequate access to things like food aid during these particularly difficult times on that infrastructure-specific target?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So I'll speak from a defense perspective of that infrastructure and then see if my colleague has any additional comments about the food security. We are attentive to the prioritized needs of the Ukrainians in terms of their own critical infrastructure. And as the coalition works to source in-demand air defense systems, to prioritize that against the infrastructure that Ukraine has identified.
Mr. Chair, and if I could just double down, obviously we get to see on the news every day and we look with our own intelligence of what is the impact on the infrastructure that was identified. I'll just double down with what my colleague there said, is that we've provided a large amount of money, over $70 million, to work with different allies to try to get what's called the immediate action on air defense, and it allowed us to work with allies to get anti-aircraft missiles in the hands of the Ukrainians as quickly as possible. So that's just an example of, like, that's a clear need from Ukraine, and we got it to them as fast as we could.
Thank you. That upholding of international law against Putin's targeting of children, of civilians, of infrastructure, I mean, it's effective, but we have to stand up to that, of course, and I know that stands across all parties, that we support that support of international law. That's key. The ICC and the ICJ are working to investigate Putin, hold him accountable. But this isn't the only crisis that we've seen across the world. This summer, I've heard from many Palestinian Canadians that are disgusted that the government, the Conservatives as well, refuse to recognize the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Many of those civilians, hospital, children are being targeted. So how can the Canadian government stand strong in terms of that upholding of international law if we don't do it consistently?
Is
My question.
important, but it is possibly beyond the remit of these particular generals. You're welcome to answer if you wish, but that's not why you were invited.
Let me just take a quick jab at it, because obviously international law, humanitarian law, law of armed conflict remains extremely important to us. And I just identify, particularly as we train Ukrainians, particularly in the UK right now and elsewhere, that is one of the core things we teach. And I would say particularly for the Ukrainians, they understand the core risk that associates if there was something to occur that's not lawful on the battlefield, and they're sensitive to it too. So we teach them international law of conflict, law of armed conflict, talk about the risks of it, and it's very important to the Ukrainians as well.
Actually, you took some of my time, Mr. Chair, so I'd love to have that extra 30 seconds.
While I intervened. So thank you.
30 seconds. I didn't stop my clock.
You have 9 seconds left. So I'm going to suspend at this point and ask the ambassador to come and make her statement, and then we'll see where that leaves us on the clock. And so welcome, Ambassador, to the committee. Okay. So let's resume. We look forward. You've been to this committee before, and we appreciate your making yourself available. Look forward to your opening statement.
Thank you. Honorable Chair, honorable members of committee, thank you for this opportunity to provide you the briefing on the situation in Ukraine as we continue to fight. First of all, I would like to thank you for the steadfast support of Canada, of Canadian Parliament, government, and the people of Canada for Ukraine and our fight against illegal and brutal Russian invasion. Your strong standing is highly valued as we continue to fight the biggest conventional war on the European continent since the Second World War. But the implications of Russian aggression against Ukraine has impact far beyond European continent, as it challenged the core concept of international rule-based order, respect of security and sovereignty of the countries around the world. Let me brief you on the situation in Ukraine. The situation on the front line is challenging, despite the Russian attempts to move forward and the lack of ammunition and equipment of Ukrainian armed forces. We managed to stabilize the situation on the front within the past week, and particularly in Donetsk direction. Now the most fightings are taking place in vicinity of Pokrovsk and Kurakhova, and is part of Ukraine. Russians have an advantage in their air and manpower, but they are suffering significant losses. According to our General Staff, as of September 16, since the start of the full-scale invasion, Russian irreplaceable losses of manpower account over 634,000 soldiers, including those wounded and killed. Russia significantly faced the losses of all the equipment. Over 8,000 of tanks, 369 aircraft, over 300 helicopters, 28 warships, 1 submarine. Ukraine has managed to destroy and disable nearly 33% of Russian Black Sea fleet. And we were managed to do it because of the bravery of the people, but also the unity and support the allies, and Canada being one of the closest of the allies provided to us. Russian troops brutally violate also the Chemical Weapon Convention by using the gas and gas grenades and the other explosive devices equipped with irritant substances. Russia continued to accumulate troops and demonstrate commitment to the war of attrition, hoping to get some gains with still their considerable resources, and the war fatigue and nuclear blackmail, all of this stuff that we have been seeing all together for the more than 2.5 years. Russian dictator Putin on September 16 signed a decree on increasing the manpower of Russian army, adding 180,000 of people for the new conscript to the Russian army. Russia has taken all ammunition from Belarus and uses artillery shells and ballistic missiles from North Korea, as well as Iranian drones. And North Korea has already supplied the aggressor with at least 10,000 shipping containers which could hold as many as 4.8 million artillery shells and up to 50 ballistic missiles that Kremlin has been using against Ukraine. So we see this act of evil is becoming closer, stronger, and a big challenge for our democracies. While not having strategic success on the battlefield, Russia seeks to destroy everything what it can capture and continue to terrorize Ukraine. Russia destroyed or damaged within the last 6 months over 9 gigawatt of power capacity throughout Ukraine, power grids, power generations. So today electricity is supplied to Ukrainian people with the huge power outrages, and the people does not have a full access to electricity, water supply. That was what Russia's strategy has been for few winters. Now we are coming to the winter, which will be one of the hardest ones. Another challenge is that Russian missile attacks, including the ballistic missile Russia is using against civilian objects. You also saw the horror in June of the attack of Ohmedit, the biggest children's hospital in Ukraine. It's like sick kids you have in Canada, where Russian ballistic missile destroyed the campus of the clinic. But then Pokrovsk followed with all 55 people who have been killed by one ballistic missile. It flies few minutes. Lviv, Kharkiv, and the other cities. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine confirms that Russian armed forces attack have caused extensive civilian harm. And since only 26th of August, there is the report of killed 64 civilians, 399 injured. The high casualty numbers follow a sharp increase in civilian deaths and injuries over the summer through this Russian terroristic attacks over the whole territory of Ukraine. And there are two specific decisions from our partners that our partners can make to help us. First is giving us the possibility for the use of long-range strikes on legitimate military targets on Russian territory. First of all, where they launch all these missile attacks, because without that, without having our sky protected, the death toll of civilians and the destroyment of the civilian buildings and infrastructure will be unfortunately increasing. And also for the partners agreeing to use their air defense capabilities to shut down missiles and drones closer to our neighbors and allies' airspace. Our allies already showed the unity to take down rockets and drones over Middle East, and it's right to demonstrate such unity in Ukraine. These missiles and drones are flying not over Ukraine, but there were few of the cases when they were flying over the territory of our neighbors. And as President Zelensky said, and I quote, "Belarus is taking the lead on shooting Russian drones now." And we are very grateful for the position of Canadian government on no restriction on the use of Western weapons and targeting using long-range weapons on Russian territory for legitimate military targets. Also, one more thing, and very important, just to finish. Last but not the least, I want to draw your attention today to another big challenge. It's Russian disinformation. Disinformation campaigns are targeting human will. And from the military perspective, as General Ayer just recently rightly said, if that will is affected before the first shot is fired, there is winning even before fighting. So the key goal of Russian propaganda campaigns is to challenge our democracies, to spread chaos and decrease the Western support to Ukraine. It is well funded, including by covered and uncovered operations, and we need to take this danger altogether very seriously. Thank you, and I'm ready for your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. So we have, if we go to 6, we can get in 2 full rounds, a 6-minute round and a 5-minute round. Is that agreeable? Okay, with that, and we appreciate Generals Ritchie and Smith staying and answering. So, Mr. Bazan, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ambassador, great to see you back here. And Generals, thanks for attending and extending your time, knowing that we had votes and a tribute in the House to one of our former colleagues that a number of us here had a chance to serve with and want to hear at the beginning of committee. Ambassador, I just want to direct most of my questions towards you. And first of all, express our gratitude to all the brave women and men serving in the Ukrainian armed forces who are standing in the face of Russian aggression, and all the brave civilians for the amazing work they do in supporting the war effort in Ukraine and standing up for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. As conservatives, we, as you know, support Ukraine. We'll always support Ukraine, and we'll continue to do so going forward every way that we possibly can. Now, you were mentioning disinformation, and were you shocked to see the Russian propaganda film Russians at War that was funded with Canadian taxpayer money through the Canadian Media Fund, which is an arm of the Canadian government?
Thank you. And I think our position on Ukraine was very clear through myself, our embassy, our government, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We were shocked that TIFF Film Festival was providing the place for the film, which is a part of Russian propaganda campaign. There are numerous reports, UN Human Rights Commission, and the other international organizations who are present in Ukraine. You all saw, and many of independent Canadian journalists were visiting Ukraine. We opened the borders for them. We all were witnessing horrific war crimes Russian soldiers committed. Bucha, Irpin, Izium, massive graves, using sexual violence as a weapon, killing civilians. And just today, the Ukrainian Human Rights Commissioner published the proven information how Russian soldiers killed the prisoner of war with the sword, the horror video, and this is what really Russian soldiers are doing in Ukraine. And I think, showing one-sided film, whitewash, is the attempt to whitewash the Russian war crimes. And that was Russia and Russian campaign has been doing by trying to blur the lines. And it's very dangerous because that's how the propaganda works. And we're really disappointed with the decision of TIFF to show this film. It's a big wound for those hundreds of civilians who have been killed and thousands of their families who lost their beloved ones by the cruelty and barbarity of Russian soldiers. I don't want to say that Russia, it's Russian soldiers, because there is a physical person who put the button for the missile to fly into the biggest kids' hospital. There is the Russian soldier who make the decision of killing those civilians. So we need to recognize that and be very clear of how we name it. It's not Russia as the collective thing. There is, every time we as a human being have a choice to do it or not. We saw what Russian soldiers have been doing in Ukraine.
Government of Canada should demand that those funds be recouped since it was used for disinformation?
We welcome decision.
It's over $345,000.
We welcome this decision of TVO board to denounce the film and stop showing it.
Back in November, in late November, General Budanov from the Ukrainian Defense Forces requested our 83,000 CRV-7 rockets to be sent to Ukraine. They were sitting in storage and slated for disposal. Our conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, in February, seeing that there was no response, demanded that they be sent from the Government of Canada, Canadian Armed Forces. There was a tranche in June announced of about 3,000 rockets and munitions that were sent. And then just finally, two weeks ago, we had the announcement that the remaining 80,000 were going to be sent. Has Ukraine received any of those rockets? And do you have a schedule of when the rest of them will be delivered for use in Ukraine so Ukraine can protect its sovereignty and its people?
Thank you for this question. Indeed, we are very grateful for the decision of DND to give us those rockets and the motors of rockets, and part of them are on the way delivered. Part of them were just announced, and logistic taking some time, but we hope the delivery will be expedited. And it is important because, as we've mentioned, for some of the parts of the front line, Russia is prevailing in the ability for artillery shots from 1 to 12. Sometimes it's 1 to 5. But even though those rockets which were decommissioned, we definitely will make them on a good use.
Good. Now, there was how much? 20 seconds. So, okay, I just want to follow up on a question that Mr. Matheson had asked. You're familiar with Armortech's survivability in London, Ontario. They refurbish LAVs. There was an article in CBC that they had indicated that they were going to be allowed to update and upgrade and then re-armor 50 LAVs, but there's been no contract with the Canadian Commercial Corporation. There's been no communication coming from the Government of Canada. Everything has gone mute. Have you heard anything at all on whether or not these LAVs will be able, I think they call them the Bob K, will they be available to Ukraine to help protect the soldiers in the battle against Russia?
Thanks a lot. We value a strong Canada support in the coalition of capabilities, and the armor capability is also over there. Like, we closely work with Canadian government and Canadian producers, and we really value that this decision is a part of also the refurbishment of the old and decommissioned vehicles. And of course, there is an urgent need for the armored vehicles, those who are newly produced and those that could be refurbished. And this is one of the ways we found that it could be expedited. We value the decision of D&D to support this project, and we are looking forward for CCC.
I don't appreciate the opportunity to cut you off, but I'm going to have to cut you off. I apologize for that. I got 2 generals and an ambassador, cut them all off. So, Mr. Collins, 6 minutes, please.
No, I think it's...
Oh, what's...
He's the only one who's spoken so far.
I know, I just looked at Chad and said, is it you next? And he said, yes.
I'm ready.
So, but...
So is everyone else.
Go to Vivian.
Vivian, okay, I apologize. Now we got that straightened out. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Your Excellency, for coming here today. How important is the role of NATO in helping to safeguard both Ukraine and the Baltic states from further Russian aggression? And what additional measures would Ukraine like to see from the alliance?
Thank you for this. Thank you for this question. First, you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for this question. First, and the most important, is the invitation for NATO. This is the thing which is crucially important and will bring both to Ukraine security, post-war security, and it will also increase capability of NATO, because today Ukrainian armed forces are really very strong and have the real combat experience among many of the NATO members. And of course, like, as we see after Russian invasion, there is a big change in the NATO. We have 2 more countries who are now the NATO members. NATO as an alliance became stronger. Today, defense and military capabilities and defense spendings and investment in all of the NATO countries are taken very seriously. And so if you would ask what is the most important, is our future NATO membership.
I'd like to ask a question of the generals, since I didn't get a chance in the first round. What is the Department of National Defense's current analysis of Russia's strategic objectives in Ukraine and the Baltic region? And the second part of my question is, how have these objectives evolved over the course of the conflict?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I'd have to admit that the strategic objectives of Russia are somewhat confusing. Obviously, if they were looking to crack NATO, it didn't happen. If they were looking to defeat Ukraine, equally, it didn't happen. And so so far they're not doing well. And indeed, with 2 new countries having joined NATO, Finland and Sweden, that shows some increasing success from the West and the continued heroism of the Ukrainian people with the support from the West. They've been unable to achieve their objectives to date.
Thank you. And how likely does the Department of National Defense assess the risk of the conflict in Ukraine spilling over into the Baltic regions or escalating into a broader regional war?
Thanks for that question, Mr. Chair. So what I respond with is that we have seen a professionalized NATO since 2022, both in terms of regional plans, functional plans, contingencies, a new readiness model called the NATO Force Model. And on the eastern flank, we have seen the augmentation from 4 to 8 battle groups and now 8 brigades. So while I can't predict possibilities on the Russian front at this level of classification, I can tell you that NATO is galvanized around this opportunity and solidarity of the alliance, including support to Ukraine.
Mr. Chair, if I can just add, because I know this committee's actually visited Latvia, I think you've seen what that has done to the alliance. We now have 14 nations participating with Canada in Latvia and have come together to provide defense to Latvia. I mean, that's all an example of how NATO has progressed since 2017 particularly. So I think that's a great sign of success and unity.
We've talked about misinformation, so I'd be interested to learn how the department has assessed the cybersecurity risk posed to NATO allies in Canada by the conflict, and what steps are being taken to bolster cyber defense in these regions.
Thanks for that question, Mr. Chair. So indeed, in 2022, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine made a request, and we immediately bolstered Ukrainian cyber defense capabilities. That relationship has been deliberate, incremental approach, and it's progressed significantly in the last 24 months. And to speak specifically, cybersecurity expertise is 24/7, cyber threat intelligence, software tools, hardware, cloud services, and engineering solutions. And this is actually two-way, reciprocal, as we furnish support but also learn from the threats that are being presented, and we're doing so with like-minded allies as well.
Thank you. Can you tell us what are the key indicators that the department would monitor to suggest any increase in military threats to the Baltic NATO members?
Chair, I can give this a try. We have intelligence. We have all those forces there that are monitoring constantly, strategic intelligence, and indeed NATO, now at 32, is doing a lot of work to continue to monitor the Baltic. And if I can say, we're cooperating widely across the 3 Baltic countries and with Poland particularly. I think, as my colleague has said, NATO has come together with plans. I worked in NATO a few years ago. That has all continued to mature to provide the deterrence, not so much the defense, but the deterrence, so that Russia would never want to take on NATO. We've shown a degree of deterrence and defense that would prevent them from trying to go after an alliance of 32.
Madame Normandin, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Excellency. It's a pleasure, always a pleasure to have you here. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
New machines.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Thank you. As I was saying, it's always a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for being here before the committee. I'd like to hear you speak to the question that I asked of the generals. As for the 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, where do things stand? Has the demand changed? Are there any new needs? What is the Allied capacity to provide these munitions? And if you have any more specific information regarding Canada, 3,000 to 5,000 units a month, is that, to you, something that should be increased?
Thank you. Indeed, 155 artillery is one of the top of the, kind of requests which our Ministry of Defense is getting directly from the front line, and it's widely seen how how Russia is not only being able to produce them, but also North Korea is providing a lot of them to Russia. We are grateful for Canada to supporting the Czech initiative, which was to provide us with the artillery shells, but of course it's. We are talking about millions, the need of the millions of artillery shells, and the need of jointly increase the production. We are also launching the part of the production in Ukraine, but of course we welcome additional support of 155 artillery shells from our partners, including from Canada and Canadian producers.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. And now, could you speak to the option or the possibility of striking deeper into military territory? I was asking the question of the journals earlier. We know that there could be launch bases or the certain chains, supply chains and others, trains, etc., within Russia. In what way could this be helpful for Ukraine versus in what way could it be an absolute game changer for you? I'd like to hear you on that qualitative side.
Thank you. And thank you for that question. It's really important because as we saw back in 2022, our ability to liberate Kherson region was because we had HIMARS. And HIMARS had the ability to strike Russian infrastructure, supply chain, deposits of all the military stock. And we saw how this Russian front line was cracking down. Because the war is also about logistic and ability to supply the soldiers to the front line. What we are facing now? We are facing now when Russia is using the aerodromes to launch the missiles deep inside Russia. Because they also understand that because we have these restrictions, the only thing we're doing in asking you for air defense systems, for missiles for them, and try to draw down Shahed drones, ballistic missiles, all the kind of the missiles almost every night. We have this air siren, and they are flying over Ukrainian sky, all over Ukrainian territory. And it's also the same about the supply chains. If we will be able to attack and destroy the Russian supply chains and those legitimate military targets, including the air bases where Russia is launching these missiles, that would be a significant change on the situation on the front line and for the civilians throughout all of the country.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais avoir une question.
Thank you. I have a longer question, which I'll keep for the second round of questions, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about disinformation. One of the aspects is that people say, oh, Ukrainian incursions are actually fake, that they're not going that well, really. And the opposite would be to use satellite imagery, for instance. Should we provide more resources to satellite imagery specifically to counter disinformation? Russia's saying one thing about the fact that the attacks are ineffective. That's wrong.
And probably hours and hours telling you what are the examples of those Russian disinformation, not only since February 24th, 2022, but back 10 years ago. You need to realize Russia is very sophisticated in disinformation and propaganda. We have historical cases where Russia was targeting Ukrainian community 30, 40, 50 years ago, when they were one of the most active to support Ukraine's independence. This is the same pattern here. The tools probably are a bit different. We have now social media, we have other resources, including so-called cultural diplomacy, what Russia has been using to spread the false narratives, few of them. Yes, sanctions are not working. But you can see on the financial result of one of the former biggest Russian company, Gazprom, it's now loss-making, with decreasing investment, decreasing the efficiency. It's one of the, the example to see. The same is about, what's happening on the front line. It's also, and there were even the cases when Russia disinformation campaigns were targeting particular soldiers in Ukraine with particular brigades to break morale of the people who are there on the trenches on the front lines. So they were so sophisticated to send the messages through Telegram channels, through other social media, saying them that they need better to surrender because all of the other commanders left the battlefield and so on. So these are very, very sophisticated operations. Many of them are done in the shadow, and you just saw the recent news from U.S. Was the investigation on a few of the companies who were working with Russian operatives and financed by them.
In 6 minutes. Ms. Madsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's been a lot of conversations, of course, about the support. Oh, and thank you, Madam Ambassador, for showing up today. There's been a lot of conversations about the equipment that's so important as part of these defensive actions that Ukraine has to take, and I know that Canadians are very, very proud to be a part of that. But we, of course, want them to be sufficient and safe. One of the conversations that Mr. Bazan had talked about in this committee itself was the supplying of the CRV-7 rockets. And a lot of the conversations that we had in this committee was to ensure that they were safe, that they were effective, that during transport it would be safe. So I'd love to hear from the generals and from you, Madam Ambassador, about what we're doing on those reviews to ensure that all of that older equipment is safe, and how they're, if that's delaying, how that's delaying it, or that all of those checks and balances are in place on both sides to ensure that safety is part of that conversation.
Chair, I can take at least from the Canadian side. And indeed, the CRV-7s, as has been indicated, there's an initial tranche that has arrived in Ukraine with a further. We're preparing for shipping. And as was identified, we've got to make sure it's safe. A small number of those rockets actually have a warhead on it. The vast majority, though, are rockets, so have an explosive capability to project forward. And so going through the necessary process to make sure that they can be transported, either by aircraft or by ship, is enormously important. Obviously, we want to hand over to our Ukrainian partners something that's going to damage their soldiers. So we've gone through that and therefore ensured that those weapon systems are safe when we're transferring them.
In terms of that reliability on the Ukrainian side.
Look, there is a bit of different perception of safety when you're fighting the war. So on the one side, we really do value, the procedures that were maintained to ensure that all the security for their transportation and the usage were tested, and now the first shipment is in Ukraine. But also you need to understand that there is always a balance between the safety standards and the pressing needs. Because if the brigade is not unarmed, all the talks about safety and security is very theoretical one. Because tomorrow these people could be injured or unfortunately could be killed if they are not equipped, if they don't have the armored vehicles to use, whether it's to fight or for the evacuation. So we do value, specifically for the rockets, that was very important for us all to ensure that while shipping, while being used in Ukraine, that this safety and security measures need to be maintained. But for many other types of equipment, we have a different perception. And urgency very often is prevailing for us because that's the choice. But I like to mention, and thanks a lot for the approach of DND of helping us build the capabilities. So providing not only, armored vehicles or the other types of weapons, but also a kit of the spare part, the maintenance support for them. It's very important because it gives the most efficient use of those weapons, and the longer term we can use it. So I just want to reiterate that we really appreciate that.
Part of the issues that we have found, and you mentioned our slowness on sanctions. It's not working. There were disappointments, of course, in terms of when it was found that Canadian-made electronic components were being found in Russian missiles and drones. I think that we discussed that here at the committee a little bit, but I would love to hear from you, Madam Ambassador, about Canada doing its due diligence in terms of monitoring that end use on arms exports, how that's impacting Ukraine right now in terms of our obligations on the arms exports.
Thank you. And indeed, we continue to find a lot of spare parts of the Western-produced, spare parts in different types of Russian weapons. Recently, with the information I can share, there were no Canadian spare parts. So we thank you for monitoring and taking, and we know that DND take it very seriously to prevent from Canadian technology to be used in the Russian war machine. There are the other allies which we are working closely for them to also step in with the more precise actions, because many of those Western spare parts we can find in the missiles, in the drones, and so on. As we are working with the D&D and Global Affairs, there is the internationally set mechanism for all the export licenses. We fully comply on our side with that.
If you could talk about Canada's role in terms of promoting, and within the international community as well, promoting anti-mine initiatives. What support does Ukraine need to further demine? I know Canadians are some of the best to do that, but what additional supports would you maybe need for that demining of the countryside, especially after this war?
Thank you. And indeed, we greatly value support that Canada is providing us in the demining field. Ukraine is now one of the most mine-contaminated country, including the grain field. We have, unfortunately, many of the casualties with the civilians and our farmers who continue to work on the field, because we remain one of the biggest grain exporters in the world. So it is a big challenge for us, and both for civilians and also for the military. So the demining and mining equipment for the military is an important, it's one of our requests on the list, but for the mining equipment for civilians, Canada was among the first countries to step in and to double at that time our capacity on the big demining machines to help us to clean, first of all, the fields, so our farmers can come back and work on the fields and supply the world with the food. Thank you.
Thank you. That completes our first round. The second round, we start with Mr. Allison, 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and to the Ambassador. Thank you for being here, and the generals as well. I have a question, Ambassador, for you. You mentioned the term nuclear blackmail. Obviously, Putin has mentioned that he's threatening that. So, in terms of the fact that he's done some terrible things, they're known for their disinformation. How likely would you think or rank the fact that he is threatening nuclear response? Do you feel that's just more disinformation, or do you feel that he's actually serious when he talks about that?
I just have the figure. If I'm not mistaken, there were 72 times since February 24th, 2022, when Russia was blackmailing with nuclear. And that is also a part of their campaign to put so-called, red lines. You remember when Ukraine was first asking about NATO weapons, what Russia did, the same narrative. Then as we were talking about tanks, then we were talking about air defense, then we were talking about the fighter jets. Now we are talking about long-range strikes, the same pattern. If you see what's happening in reality, and including with our Kursk operation, you can find yourself and make, I think, your own conclusion. What is this blackmailing? It's a common Russian strategy just to hold our partners and hold some of decisions with the support of Ukraine. That's all about.
Do you feel the same? You feel it's just disinformation, or is there a legitimate threat?
Chair, the only thing I'd add is that's it's in Russian doctrine. Their escalation dominance, always trying to make it look like they're going to go farther. It's in standard Russian doctrine. There are nuclear weapons, though, but at the same time, on the alliance side, the alliance is very well aware of that, and obviously providing the deterrence that we have with its own nuclear capability.
I'm going to take the. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ellison, for splitting your time. Ambassador, the government of Canada, promised back in January 2023 that they were going to send some NASAM air defense system to you. In March of 2023, Minister Anand said it was en route, and now we're hearing it might show up sometime in January 2025. I know you need them now. That system would be very important in protecting the cities and the civilians of Ukraine. Have you received a hard date when the NASAM will be delivered?
Indeed, we really appreciate the decision to help us with air defense system. It's in production. It's both the Canadian and the system which our other partners also committed to support us with the system. All of them are now in production. U.S. manufacturer. We are looking forward. I think at that stage, none of us can make any help for expedite them. That's the production process. We have some estimation of dates, which is more linked to the producer. But also what would be very helpful is the additional supply for the missiles for this air defense system, because we have few of them now in Ukraine. We, of course, are looking forward to get more, but without the missiles, we can't use them. So if there is any possibility to also to provide us the missiles for the system, that will be also very helpful. Meanwhile, the system will arrive.
Ambassador, the CRV-7 rockets, which are a Canadian-made rocket, is also a manufacturer of missiles and still in existence and still has capability to produce missiles. So I'd hope that the government of Canada would be looking at our own domestic capabilities and industrial strengths that we have in the defense industry to provide you with more of those missiles. Now, we talked a little bit about the 777 howitzers, the M155 shells. Government has delayed and dithered on getting our production increased here. Can you tell us, Ambassador, whether or not Canada is shipping any increase in M155 ammunition rounds to Ukraine, or are you accessing those rounds from other countries?
As I've said, Department of National Defense joined the Czech coalition to supply Ukraine with 155 artillery shells. That's the international coalition, and many other countries joined with financial contribution to allow our Czech colleagues to procure and supply to Ukraine those 155 artillery shells. We greatly value that. But we see also in general there is the lack of production capability around the world. We see it also as we are starting our own production, and there are a lot of, the supply chain issues for this production. And we started to talk about this back 2 years ago, that defense industry is now our great partner, but also a big bottleneck. So while working together, we need to ensure that we all are able to produce, because sometimes it's not about the funding, just the physical capacity. And I would also like to thank you, many of Canadian defense producers who are working on production of this military supply. I think a bigger part of this military support that Canada has provided for us are produced in Canada here, and I visited a lot of them, and I really want to take this opportunity to thank you, those companies, the people are working there for their efforts.
5-minute questions seem to be getting into the 6.5 range, 7 minutes. Madame Lalonde, 5 minutes.
My colleague, Emanuela.
Madame Lambropoulos, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here with us to discuss this important matter today. My first question will be for Ambassador Kovaliv. You mentioned in your opening remarks that allies The support that Ukraine has received from allies is one of the major reasons why it's seen the successes that it has seen, along with, of course, the bravery of the soldiers on the ground. Canada has committed over $4.5 billion in military assistance and has trained over 40,000 Ukrainian troops. And I'm wondering if you can speak to which investments have been the most helpful and what more we can do at this stage.
Thank you. Indeed, I would like to thanks for the robust military support and, as I mentioned, for the approach that we are building together the capabilities. So if we're talking about the fighter jets capability, Canada is helping us to train Ukrainian pilots, because it's not only that the other partners are providing us F-16 fighter jets, but also we need to have well-trained pilots who can effectively operate them. When it comes to the armored vehicles coalition, it's not only the armored vehicles, but there's this whole supply chain. And there are many, many other examples. One of the things I want to mention and want to thank you in the presence of generals here is the training program Unifier. It started back in 2015, and when the war started, we have over 30,000 of Ukrainian men and women trained by Canadian trainers through the Unifier program. Now the figures are much bigger. We are coming close to the 40,000. But now I think, and probably generals can also say about this, it's not only one-sided training. It's really the exchange of experience. And it's really a win-win for both our armed forces and for the members of Canadian armed forces. I always have a privilege to meet the teams who are coming on a rotation for the 6 months from Unifier, and I'm always really touched on how they feel proud being a part of the Unifier program and how this exchange and how the people stay connected. So we are also building this relations among, the people who are physically protecting us, our soldiers.
Thank you so much. You also spoke in your opening remarks about how long-range weaponry would be helpful at this stage, Ukraine's ability to use that into Russia. And I know that Major Generals Smith and Ritchie also spoke to this a little bit earlier, but you were cut off a little short. So I know that you may want to finish the thought that you had started earlier. But I can I'll start with Ambassador Kovalev to explain why this would be beneficial at this stage.
Thank you. As I've said, you can't protect, for example, as we saw a few months ago near Kharkiv or Chansk, when Russia was trying to advance from the northeast 30 kilometers to Russian border. If we are not able to strike on the Russian territory, it's very hard to protect, especially those big cities who are closer to Russian border, because it's also the legitimate target is the Russian military depots, all the logistics that they are using, and the places where Russia launched their missiles, including ballistic missiles. So there are two ways: either significantly increase air defense and help us to draw down missiles and drones, including at least on the western border, and we see the examples when Russian drones were falling down on the territory of NATO members. And we saw the unity, how this can be successfully intercepted in the Middle East. So it's both of the decisions from our allies is crucially needed for us.
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So indeed, it stretches the battlefield and the complexion of the conflict, and it exposes more vulnerable second and third echelon forces of the Russian military apparatus that are operating in depth. Certainly a capability that we recognize its inherent benefits, and that's why we're excited under Canada's new ONSAF policy to also get to explore this capability for the Canadian Armed Forces.
Thank you.
Right on 5 minutes. 30 seconds.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. A two-part question for the ambassador and for the generals. I'd like to know to what extent Ukrainian civilians are mobilized right now to get to the front? Are we at a full-scale war, or would there be some room to mobilize civilians? Let's say there would be more support by replacing them logistically with, let's say, international forces from the medical standpoint also. And if we could mobilize more of these, when it comes to Alid, the Operation Alid, would we be able to form or train more recruits given we were to have an increased number of recruits?
Thank you. Mobilization in Ukraine is coming. It's in place. We digitalized a lot of the services, so now all the men aged for conscription are registered for their data, and we know them. But from the one side, on the military side, we don't need all the men of that age to be directly sent to the front line. The other, because there is a part of critical infrastructure, there is part of the defense production, there is part of the economy, because country need to continue to live, the business need to continue to work. But there is one more reality, that we don't have enough equipment, so there is no need to send the people who are untrained and unequipped to the front line. So our strategy is not what Russia is doing, sending the people just 2-3 weeks ago conscripted as this kind of unfortunately it's called like a meat to be killed on the front line. So that's why we so much value all the training programs we have. So the people are going obligatory training, but then they come to the need of equipment. And that's why if we are talking about the armored vehicles or the other type of equipment which we need to equip brigades, that's where timing is essential. Because imagine that we have today the plan to equip, several big brigades, but there is no equipment.
Mr. Chair, if I might just add, I had the privilege to be deployed to Wiesbaden in January and February of 2022 on the eve of the invasion and then for the next 6 months. And it was utterly inspiring to watch the population that was spoken to, of all ages, rallying together to present unified front. Farmers towing abandoned Russian vehicles, families throwing Molotov cocktails at invading Russians. It was inspiring for the alliance to watch this solidarity. And if I may just speak to the ambassador's comment, is one of the most successful programs has been the Train the Trainer. You spoke about LID and the ability to train recruits. Well, working together, we have trained 173 trainers who are now training their own recruits. And to the ambassador's earlier point, we're learning as much as we are teaching. It is a very reciprocal relationship as we're learning from war-hardened soldiers of Ukraine.
5 minutes, Ms. Madison.
Thank you. Ambassador, I had asked earlier of the major generals about the 20,000 children that had been abducted by Russia. I wrote to the Minister of Foreign Affairs on behalf of the Ukrainian Council, London chapter, but we haven't heard back yet, unfortunately. But can you tell us how Canada can increase more of that diplomatic pressure on Russia and do our part to help Ukraine return these children to their homes?
Thank you. Indeed, part of the weapons of war, unfortunately, are the children. They are the most vulnerable. We have documented over 19,000 of cases, the Ukrainian children who have been forcefully deported to Russia. Some of them have been already illegally abducted by Russian families. Some of them, unfortunately, 16-year-old boys, we have the evidence that they have been sent to the military camps for training. And there is a big risk that Russia will try to send them on the front lines. We are working together with the other partners, and I would like to stress the big role Qatar is playing to help us to return the children. We have now, unfortunately, only a little bit more than 600 of Ukrainian children who we managed together to bring back. But in order to put also the diplomatic pressure and the awareness, together with Canada, Ukraine co-lead the international coalition to return Ukrainian children back. We are now having 40 countries from around the world who joins the coalition, and we will be this number will be growing. And at the end of October, we will have here in Canada, and we're thankful for Global Affairs and Minister Jolie, the conference. Part of that agenda will be on our international efforts to bring the children, Ukrainian children back, to support coordinate our diplomatic efforts. Canada is also supporting us to help those children who we managed to bring back to Ukraine to rehabilitate, because these children suffered a lot, including the mental health, including the need of them to resettle. So we greatly value this. And this is one of the most horrific crimes, because this is the crime for those who are the most vulnerable. And this is a part of the Russian breach of the international law, because the crimes against children are most of the highest punished, and that's why the global arrest warrant for Putin is based on the crimes against Ukrainian children.
Welcome to committee. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ambassador, Major General Smith and Major General Ritchie, thank you for your service. I spent some time with the Ontario Regiment in the 80s, and more recently as the last 6 years as honorary colonel with the 2 Intelligence Company in Toronto. And during those training nights, we would often talk about drones and the importance of drones to the safety of our troops and the execution of our strategy. I'm wondering about the activities of the CAF in planting urgently any of these drones, as small surveillance or attack drones that can be operated in conjunction with our ground forces.
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So drones have been a game changer, like a couple of other capabilities on the battlefield, and one that we're monitoring carefully, learning from Ukrainian partners in the fight with Russia, and also working as we look to procure these capabilities going forward through our recent ONSAF policy, because there is so much opportunity as the drone capability presents, and we think it will be evolutionary in the coming years.
So we have plans to have those with our troops in Latvia?
Yeah, so what I can speak to, Mr. Chair, is that we're upskilling the brigade to 3,000 persistent troops deployed, with additional capabilities available to deploy from Canada in the form of an additional battalion. The battle group will be under the brigade. It will be Canadian-led, 14 countries. Amongst the coalition of the 14 countries, I do believe that we have drone capability. This is something that the Canadian Armed Forces is interested in and looking to expand our capability in this going forward.
I understand that the brigade, there will be a significant number of reservists staffing that brigade, and that leads me to wonder about training in advance of deployment. Are we going to have soldiers that arrive trained and ready to execute our mission in Latvia?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question, Mr. Chair. So obviously, the professional preparation of soldiers for conflict and service in NATO is top of mind. And what we're trying to do is strike the balance between high caliber training with minimizing time away from home in terms of quality of life before they deploy. Because we have had challenges in past years where soldiers may deploy for multiple months before they then go away for 6 to 9 months deployments. So what we're finding now is the opportunity to conduct the validation training forward in Adazi, and the next brigade validation will become during the period 4 to 14 November, where we'll be able to deliver that high caliber training forward in Latvia.
Back in March 22, we had been pushing the Liberal government to provide our surplus LAV-2s to send them to Ukraine. We had some that were serviceable, but we had, I think the number is 62 that were in repairable condition but deemed surplus, but they would take 220 days to fix. That was in June 2022. And I'm wondering if those were ever repaired and sent to Ukraine.
Mr. Chair, I can't speak to those specific statistics. That being said, we're working actively with Ukraine. If they're asking for Hulks, M113s, Lab 2s are said, we're moving them as quickly as we can. Obviously, Armatech came up with ECLI, which is the refurbishment of that, and we're continuing to work through that to achieve a contract as quickly as possible.
Oh, okay.
Answer the question specifically about the refurbishment of the 62. Understand that it's not necessarily in your own in your notes, but if you could undertake to the committee to respond, that would be helpful.
We'll take that on notice, Chair.
Okay.
The last thing I would ask you is our current battle group in Latvia, do we possess the sufficient capabilities to defend against the current state of the Russian military?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Mr. Chair. So right now, that brigade is formidable, has infantry, armor, artillery, tactical helicopters that just recently deployed from the Royal Canadian Air Force, medical logistics and sustainment. Combat engineers are deploying in 2025. This is Canadian-led, multinational, 14 countries, and those other troop-contributing nations bring incredible capability as well. That said, we are mindful of the changing threats, and we're looking to procure new capability through new technology and the new policy that we have to be able to ensure that our forward-leaning forces are successful going forward.
Mr. Pawlowski, final 5 minutes.
Dobry den, Ambassador. You talked about the importance of assistance in air defense. When there was a conflict in Syria that the United States was involved in, Western forces were willing to enforce a no-fly zone over Syria. I think after the initial attack in 2022, Ukraine was asking for support in enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Is Ukraine still formally asking for that support?
Ukraine is asking for many of the different instruments to protect the sky, including the air defense system itself, the missiles for them, including our partners to help us to draw down the missiles and drones, including in the western border, including the preventing of those strikes. So there are different. We have also a very big and serious pending issue is the Russian occupation of the biggest civilian nuclear plant, 6 gigawatt Zaporizhia nuclear plant, where it is since the spring of 2022 under Russian occupation was huge risk possessing not only to Ukraine but all of the surrounding countries. And the missiles, drones are flying very close in the vicinity of the reactors itself, which is a huge risk for millions of people.
Now, this is a question both to the generals and to the ambassador. I think in 2022, when the issue of a no-fly zone came up, the response from the West is this would be very problematic. It would possibly result in global warfare in case Western NATO forces were to shoot down Russian planes flying over Ukraine. But right now, given the advances in the Ukrainian army with surface-to-air missiles, with Patriot missile systems, are there any Russian planes flying over Ukrainian airspace? And if there are no longer Russian either airplanes or helicopters flying over presently occupied Ukrainian airspace, has the situation not changed materially? So perhaps there would be more of an argument for NATO enforcing a no-fly zone, which would be shooting down drones and missiles, so Russians wouldn't be getting killed in their planes over Ukraine. So is it a concept that we ought to be reconsidering? Is NATO taking an active role in supporting a no-fly zone over Ukraine?
Chair, I'll start, but you have the disadvantage of having a bunch of Army guys up here, and we'll do our best. Which So that's a military operation, and Ukraine is a big country. It's over 600,000 square kilometers. And so to protect that, you would need to position forces right inside Ukraine. And it's not just having a fighter. Well, now you have an air base, and you have to protect the air base. You have to supply the air base. And it's not just simply setting up a fighter, but how do you defeat enemy air defenses? This is a full-up operation. NATO would become engaged in that conflict. We are supporting Ukraine the best we can, and I'd like to go back to the amount of air defenses that, including Canada, are trying to supply Ukraine to have them do the job. And then more recently, the $389 million announced for fighter lead-in training and further training to enable the Ukrainians to win the war themselves.
Ambassador, in my remaining time, I give the floor to you as an opportunity to say what you would like to say to the Canadian people and to the Canadian government.
Thank you. There were 369 Russian airplanes flying, which have been destroyed. But indeed, the protection of the sky is a huge issue, both for the military, civilians, and Honorable Member Don Stewart was talking about the drones. Drones and also the drones which are using artificial AI is now a game changer. So it's not the conventional war that you saw before. That's also the war on technology, both the drones, the electronic warfare. We already created one of the first, a special part of the forces, which is called unmanned forces. So we are using actively different types of the drones. Air drones, sea drones, or the just unmanned vehicles on the front line. And Ukraine is now on the edge of this technological development. This year, we will be procuring, by the end of the year, for Ukrainian armed forces, 1 million of drones of different types. Small one, long range, short range, surveillance drones. We are doing it because of this is partly substituting the lack of artillery and artillery shells. There are some part of the front line which is controlled only by the drones. And sometimes the small drone, which costs several thousands of dollars, can destroy a tank or the armored vehicle. So it is a new type of war. What we also was offering and working with allies and with Canada, and we see on our side a big potential of it, is cooperation in the drone production. Today, Ukraine is a testing ground, not only for the drones, but also their usage against the strong Russian electronic warfare. Because it's not only to have a good drone. You need this drone to be able to fly, and your enemy's electronic warfare, it needs to withstand your enemy's electronic warfare. So this is a big defense technology new era in the military where we believe we are on the front line, and we are ready to share our experience, but also we want to welcome this more cooperation on this production so we can be leading together on this stage.
That does bring our time together. I just wanted to thank all members and our witnesses for cooperation in parliamentary circumstances, which occasionally are difficult. Particularly, I want to thank Generals Ritchie and Smith for their patience, staying much longer than they were scheduled to do so. And Ambassador Kovalev, always great to see you. We appreciate your ability to give us the view from Ukraine on this conflict. So, with that, colleagues, we will adjourn. We will carry on with the threat briefing next Thursday morning. Our clerk has promised us to cook a special breakfast for us. Yeah. Yes. So, with that, meeting adjourned. Didn't know that, eh?